Therese. Thank you. So we begin with Cecilia Waldenström from the Department of Urban and Rural Development here at SLU. Cecilia has a background in agronomy, education, and rural sociology. Her research has focused on agricultural extension and rural development in Sweden and on agrarian change viewed from the perspective of farming households. Cecilia will talk about agrarian change in Sweden and contexts for construction of knowledge in agriculture. Welcome, Cecilia.
Thank you. Thank you, Clara. So this is my 5-minute summary of the presentation on the website. And in that presentation, I focus on 2 different strands. One is this brief history of changes of cultivation systems and the policy means connected to them. And you can say that this is a kind of Swedish version of processes from Northern Europe the last 2 centuries. I start with the 19th century with the change of cultivation system in Sweden, which led to a more biologically balanced system, building on how to handle crop rotation and manure, but it was also connected to breaking up the villages and moving farms out into the landscape and breaking up the old village tilling system. And the state was very active in this, together with increasingly the agricultural societies in the counties, which became a kind of advisory organization. This system lasted up to until the 1940s, when a new system came after the Second World War with an enormous change of modernization. And this, I suppose you could really call the Deagrarianisation of Sweden, wherein during a few decades, 80% of the farm holdings disappeared, 1 million hectares of arable land was left and mainly went to forestry. And the proportion of active population in economically active population in agriculture went down from 20 to 1%. And this was at the same time a fast industrialization and urbanization during 3 decades. The state, the industry, and also the farmers' cooperative were very active in this process, actually. And there was a very elaborate, sort of very big advisory system, which already in the 1980s started to be dismantled and left over to industry. My second strand is this building on this qualitative study of agrarian change in 3 regions in Sweden, which I've been part of, and which also Flora Heide was part of, where we followed up on a previous study from the 90s, which I also was part of. And I'm looking at this as context for learning in agriculture and changes. What I look at then is, of course, the kind of farming in the regions. Is it farming in decline? Are there farms still being abandoned? How far is it between farms? How many farmers are left? And things like that. And then the institutional context, like education, other agricultural schools, the research, advisory services, food industries, and secondary industries, which have a very strong impact on knowledge construction, as they have their ideas about how the produce should be. And then other actors who engage in production as consumers and as perhaps municipalities who want to preserve agriculture in their area and things like that. And also new people who want to engage in farming, as Paul was talking about. Can you change slide, please? So these are the 3 study areas we were in. And if we start with the southern plains, which is in the black text, this is further southernmost part of Sweden, which is where we mainly have crop farming, and it's Sweden's most productive agricultural region with very good soils and landscape, which simplifies large-scale farming. And the institutional context, of course, is very good and very elaborate. You can say that this is frontline conventional farming practices in Sweden, but there is also research on agroecology and, of course, people applying such practices. In the mid-Swedish plains, it's also good in many ways, and it's been we can move over to the northern area then, where there's mainly extensive farming and especially inland and grazing. And here we saw a sort of breakdown of institutions around farming, which especially compared to the 1990 study, where people seek advice from outside or they build their own infrastructures, for instance, a small abattoir and study circles, and sort of knowledge production on building networks afar and in the locality. If you can change slide again, please. finish this off. This discussion that I want to initiate is that this century we also need a new cultivation system, because this cultivation system we have now in conventional agriculture is not tenable. But what are the means for changing production system in the 21st century? Who are the main actors in the food system today who would need to pursue and support this? And who will farm and where? In the longer presentation, I have a slide on expected climate change in Europe and what kind of lands will be possible or not possible to cultivate. I think we need a new kind of agrarianization, and we need to delve into the question about how that can be shaped. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And we move right on to the next presenter, which is Ildiko Astalos Morel from the Department of Urban and Rural Development here at SLU. Ildiko is a sociologist with interest in rural transformation during state socialism and post-socialism, intersectional aspects of rural marginalization and poverty, Romani studies, migration, and comparative gender research. Ildiko will talk here today about food poverty and deagrarianisation in rural Hungary. Welcome, Ildiko.
Yeah, hi. I would start my talk, and you can change to the first slide, that Central East European countries have been integrated to the European Union as the semi-periphery with substantially lower GDP and personal incomes. Food poverty has become a concomitant feature of this integration, which can be seen in the high proportion of food in household spendings in the CEE countries. Poverty is most profound in the rural peripheries, and rural Roma are the most hit. While under state socialism, Roma's economic activity rate was close to the national average, short after the transition to capitalism, it has fallen to the third of the average. The overwhelming majority of Roma have not been able to return to the mainstream labor market. One of the paradoxes of the transition has been that despite of high rural food poverty, the rural underclass, including Roma, is not practicing subsistence production. Asking the question of why Roma are discriminately hit by transition to capitalism, we need to consider both structural and recognitional aspects. Transition led to the loss of every fourth job, while under state socialism, the cooperatives took on the coordination of marketing the products of the household production of cooperative workers. The collapse of cooperative food chains contributed to the rapid drop of household engaged with production to the 1/4 of previous levels. Furthermore, if you could change to the next slide. The dependent development path of Central Eastern Europe with persistence inequality facilitates counter-selective mobilities, resulting in brain and care drain, leaving the least skilled among these Roma behind. Meanwhile, through internal mobility, the least skilled move towards the rural margins, intensifying rural ghettoization. An important driver of precarization is the transition from neoliberal to authoritarian workfare regimes with increased curtailment of social rights. The increased racialization of poverty manifests in the structural overrepresentation of Roma in the underclass and medial and political racialized construction of undeservingness that make some to see the root cause of Roma marginalization in racism. My point of departure is that we need both lenses to obtain a full picture, and we also need a better grip on agrarian transition to understand food poverty. Transition to capitalism implied the embedment of the economy from local communities, as well as the decline of locally available food for consumption, most paramountly in the rural ghettos of the margins. Please change the picture. The authoritarian workfare regime expanded public work during the past decade. Eligibility to social benefits assumes at least 1 month of employment the past year. This makes public work, despite of poor work conditions, a desired option in the rural peripheries, fostering paternalistic dependencies on the local power holders. Meanwhile, it provides a resource to poor municipalities, and half of the over 200,000 jobs are in agricultural activities. During my fieldwork in several municipalities during the past decade, I found that while there are municipalities that use public work as a disciplinary method with racist label, there is a growing innovative engagement of progressive municipalities. These municipalities use the produce for public institutions, while others distribute it among the needy. Several of the studied municipalities engage actively in promoting household-based production of public workers by transmitting know-how, seeds, animals, and accounting labor time in the household to public work. By this, revitalizing the traditions from cooperative coordination of household production. There are also a number of NGOs engaging with more participatory methods in revitalizing household-based production. Food sovereignty movements have either emerged as bottom-up movements of the peasantry or have been driven by state promotion of independent farmers. The case of public work-based food systems in Hungary do not fit any of these models. So my question is to conclude if we can see elements of a third way to food sovereignty in these combined efforts of NGOs and progressive municipalities, and how we can evaluate the state socialist legacies in this respect.
Thank you very much, Ildiko. And then we move on to the last presenter in this session, which is Brian Kuhns. He's also from the Department of Urban and Rural Development here at SLU. So Brian works on post-communist agrarian change in Eastern Europe, and he has, for example, sought to critically reevaluate Soviet and pre-Soviet legacies in the light of current-day agrarian and environmental challenges in the region. Brian will talk today about an agricultural boom amid deagrarianization, post-communist Ukraine's integration into the global food regime. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Clara. You can go to the next slide, please. So what I want to do in this presentation is to summarize my recorded presentation and draw out some of the theoretical implications. Paul Hebnick, in his recent editorial in Journal of Rural Studies, identifies 4 trends that are usually associated with deagrarianization, and they are depeasantization and pressure on family farmers, a squeeze on agriculture caused by global markets, continuing agricultural industrialization, and competition for land. I want to quickly situate Ukraine in some of these trends. So today there is depopulation of villages due to drastically reduced employment in agriculture following post-communist land reform and the breaking up of the collective farms. This is depeasantization. Also, you have the rise of farming corporations in Ukraine, some of which are among the largest in the world. And I have a lot more detail about this in the recorded presentation. Soviet agriculture was already industrialized, if we're going to talk about agriculture industrialization, but it was industrialized in a very different way. So the interesting story here, which relates to questions of agricultural knowledge that Cecilia talked about, is the transition from one kind of industrialization, a Soviet form, to a capitalist form of agriculture industrialization. This transition was very rapid and showing a fundamental compatibility. And then about competition for land. Land reform gave land to former collective farm workers, allowing only lease. A proposal to allow farmland sales has just been approved, with sales starting next year. So lease is low in Ukraine, lower than anywhere in the EU. One reason among many is that there is a monopsony. That is to say, very many landowners and relatively few land users. You can perhaps say that corporations are winning the competition for land right now, but we still don't know what effect farmland sales will have. So this question has to be followed closely. I should have put in this slide that the competition for land in Ukraine has an important gender dimension that remains unexplored. 60% of all landowners are women. This is due both to demographics, but also to the gender division of labor on the collective farm. You can go to the next slide, please. So one of the main points of Hemnick's editorial is that deagrarianization trends do not explain everything, that we cannot really understand what is happening in rural areas without taking into account counter tendencies, rural agency, or agency on the part of rural people. And many of these counter tendencies have a very local character. So in this regard, there are areas of thriving smallholder production in Ukraine, which can be framed as repeasantization. But whether or not it can thrive is dependent on a number of external factors, very similar to what Flora was talking about for South Africa. For smallholders in places that lack these characteristics, there is only one free niche, which is milk production. And that's milk production is today dominated by smallholders. This milk production is often dependent on symbiotic relations with large enterprises. Smallholders lease out their land to a large enterprise who pay their lease in grain, which the smallholders use to feed their cows and other animals. So there's not a strong opposition between smallholders and corporations in Ukraine, and this is one of the reasons. Another reason is that smallholders and corporations occupy different production niches with different end consumers. So I'll now show a quote that exemplifies how people feel about industrialized farming. This is from a focus group I was involved with in 2018. And in this focus group, we were asking what people thought about the landscape. The natural landscape in Ukraine is steppe, and we're asking what the landscape or steppe meant to them. And this woman, who was elderly and had performed manual labor on the collective farm in her youth, she responded as you see here. She said, you know, the dawn has just begun, the sun is coming up, it is quiet, the birds sing, and the combine goes choop, choop, choop. And we fix the hay, a vehicle comes and loads grain. It is noisy and beautiful. For her, the natural state of the landscape is not natural steppe, but mechanized agriculture with workers out in the field. So I'm perhaps hanging a lot on one quote here, but my interpretation is that industrialized farming is the baseline for living memory in the countryside, and this affects how people see corporations. Next slide. So I hesitate to make predictions about the future, but I can say that to understand what is happening today in Ukraine, we need an historical perspective. Deagrarianization was actually explicit Soviet policy. This was done ineffectively, but perhaps in some good faith following the Second World War. However, before the war, it was done in a way that was intended to eliminate the peasantry as a way of life and social class. Here I'm talking about the Holodomor, the Great Famine in Ukraine in the early 1930s. But my larger point is that deagrarianization tendencies are occurring today in Ukraine because of a paradoxical mix of sort of contemporary capitalism and Soviet communist legacies. The Soviet legacy also helps to explain some of the counter tendencies. There is sometimes a sense that history in this region begins with 1991, the Soviet collapse, but we have to look further back to understand what is happening. I'll end here. I have a lot more detail in the longer version, which is recorded. I look forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Brian. And we can now stop sharing the slideshow. And we move on to the questions and answers. So, yeah, I'm moderating with two screens here. Sometimes it's a bit tricky to see where you are. No. So let's see here. Yes, we have a question already from Lucas Nainggolan from Universitas Indonesia. What kind of new agrarianization does Cecilia mean in detail? What is the mechanism for this to happen? Through policies or from farmers' initiatives? I suppose this is in relation to your own questions on your last slide, Cecilia.
I can say that I see this need for changing a cultivation system again from the heavily from a system which is so detrimental for the agroecological realities and where the returns are sort of falling. And there is, I think it's both from farmers and from the state. And I think maybe with one effect of this COVID-19 is the sort of reevaluation of the state, perhaps, I don't know. But I think the sort of food system that much of Swedish agriculture is involved in has to do with sort of food regimes that are controlled through networks of very large interest and corporations, and I think that we need a change somehow. I'm not quite sure how we will get there, but I don't know if policy will have the same. During the 19th and 20th century, the state was quite strong in dealing with these things, and now the state has sort of given away a lot of its say on production. And I think if we go into studies of food consumption and how that is steered through large corporations, we see the problems of this. I think there is a lot of farmers working with new ways, at least in Sweden, but it's still sort of small streams, but hopeful small streams. I also think that when I talk about agrarianization, that land will go out of production for climate change reasons, and we will need to sort of think about what kind of land and how it should be, what kind of production techniques we can have on different kinds of land. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. You can also, I just want to say to the panelists that you can also pose questions to each other. So remember that. I have a question for Ildiko. I wonder if you want to develop a bit on that. You say that the rural underclass is both marginalized and at the same time they are not farming on the land that they have available. So can you describe a little bit about the reasons that these people in Hungary are not farming? Because I think we can draw many parallels there later to South Africa also in the common discussion.
Yeah. Part of the puzzle is just this counter-selective mobilities I mentioned, that there has been large mobility to the rural margins of those with least resources in society, and this movement came to those areas which are aging and depopulating. So and those moving not necessarily have agricultural background, so that can explain part of it, but one finds similar phenomena even in those areas where there are marginalized segments of villages, so there would be possible to have some kind of knowledge about this kind of production. So somehow it's has been a disarming of communities of those marginalized that happened from the period of transition very rapidly, and it's seems to be very difficult to revert. So today, if one looks at the surrounding gardens of these houses, so they haven't been cultivated for 10, 20 years. So it is very difficult also to start it. And for the others, so if we think about Roma as a big segment of this group of marginalized, so traditionally they didn't have access to land. Meanwhile, during state socialism, there was a kind of peasantization. So those who lived in rural areas also took this pattern of cooperatives coordinating local production. So, but many of these traditional patterns have partially changed. So there are multiple reasons behind.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Paul Hebbink, or a comment. we should make a clear distinction between deagrarianisation and depeasantization. The first does not exclude the expansion of corporate farming. The second involves solving the peasant question. And I can see that Brian is nodding. Do you want to say something, Brian, as well?
Yes. I would say a couple of things. One, in terms of depeasantization, in terms of, say, depopulation in the countryside, people leaving the countryside, leaving the village, leaving an agrarian way of life. I think this is more along the lines of what David Neves was talking about with Bernstein's agrarian question of labor. That these are people who used to work in the collective farm. The collective farm employed, a collective farm would employ a lot of people compared to what you have today, which is very labor efficient farming. So these people have become surplus, and it's just a question of, and then it becomes a question of, their livelihoods. Perhaps I haven't understood the comment correctly, so I think when we go to the general discussion, maybe Paul could comment a little bit more on that.
Thank you, Brian. At the moment, we're not having any new questions in the, here, now it's coming. So Tulup Akinbobola is asking specifically to Brian, are you saying reactivating peasant farming is a potent strategy for achieving successful re-agrarianization and rural livelihood resuscitation? Yeah, Brian first.
Okay, I would just say quickly, in terms of the area where I have done research, Ukraine, I would say that to a limited extent, yes, but as this is also in a paper that I published in 2017, I don't think, sort of say, repeasantization is a strategy that can be, that say a great number of people can use. It's not going to solve, say, the unemployment crisis in the countryside, but it is a potential solution for some.
And Ildiko?
Well, taken the Hungarian example, I find similarities with what was discussed in the earlier webinar, that it's not, I mean, in case of those most marginalized who don't have substantial access to land, which is also part of this aspect. So it is not a potential solution to base livelihoods on, but it can be a buffer to countervail the inequalities in society and give some kind of better food security. At the other hand, it can be a possibility for some because there are intensive ways of cultivation that don't require a large amount of land, and that has been practiced during state socialism, that on the small gardens surrounding the homes of cooperative workers, one has engaged with intensive greenhouse production, and the cooperative was both providing with seeds and also selling the products. So similar kind of coordinating activities could also give opportunity to develop this kind of home-based agriculture.
Thank you. So now we have two questions here. I will take the question from Madeleine Fogde first, because she hasn't asked the question before, and it's a new topic. Thank you for interesting presentations. Can you see links between the deagrarianization and the migrant workers moving to commercial agriculture in other EU countries? Now these migrants are stopped by COVID-19. Does that affect productive activities in the rural areas? So this has been debated a lot in Swedish radio in the past weeks. and it's a big issue for Swedish farmers at the moment that have difficulties getting the migrant workers here that they have been having here for several years, working under, doing hard work in agriculture. Cecilia waved, I think, to start with.
Yeah, so, well, I just want to say that there's an obvious link between the sort of changes in agrarian production systems and the migrant workers, that how Swedish agriculture has successively become dependent on migrant workers, and that has to do with, I think it has to do with the price squeeze quite a lot, and how yeah, that you can work as a seasonal worker abroad when you come from a low wage country in a different way than you would do if you were a Swedish worker, for instance. And I also think that I think of this survey we did in the 1990s of Swedish farming, where not very many had employed the agricultural labor at all. Even the large farms didn't have that, and now that has changed completely. And many also have laborers from abroad. For instance, also in dairy industry, large dairy farms have people working in the dairy coming from Poland or from the Baltic countries. So it has changed a lot, and now of course there is a crisis in all this, but it's part of this shift.
Yeah.
Yes, Ildiko.
I mean, migrant, there are studies showing translocal connections between migrant workers from Eastern Europe working in the West, and how these remittances contribute to improved consumption in the local sending countries. It is also quite obvious that these workers are employed below wages of the receiving countries, and social rights and benefits are not necessarily connected with this type of work. So there has been discussions on how COVID, the fear of getting the infection while moving to the receiving countries, what happens if one gets sick, which country bears the costs of it. So it is a very it is, as I mentioned, an expression of this semi-periphery dependent development. And I don't know about studies looking at how this impacts that a large section of rural population in the East is engaged with agricultural labor in the West in the high agricultural season. What does it have for impact on local agriculture? So that would be also interesting to see.
Thank you very much, Ildiko. Brian, did you want to say something?
Yes, not specifically for this question, but just I want to talk about COVID and connect back to an earlier question in the previous round. And I believe it was Paul Hebnick who was saying that, or David Neve said that governments have acted with an alacrity, a swiftness, and Paul Hebnick talked about this, perhaps there's this questioning of where should production take place, a questioning of globalization. And I think that COVID-19, to the extent that this kind of questioning of globalization kind of translates into some sort of anti-globalization or anti-trade or whatever, I think it would be a disaster for example, Ukrainian agriculture, which exports a lot to its third largest agricultural exporter to the EU. It exports to North Africa, India, a lot of countries. I think it would be a disaster for a lot of EU countries. It would be a disaster for a lot of exporting countries that produce a surplus. That may, or maybe it's a disaster that has to come, but I do think that farm lobbies are very politically strong, and that they would be motivating their respective governments to try to kind of protect agricultural trade as the way it is. So I think that there's some arguments that can be made that kind of the broad trends of agricultural trade might not be so affected in the long term.
Thank you very much. We have to stop there now. We still have some unanswered questions. You're welcome to repost your question during the panel discussion as well. We will now go for a break again, which means that the second Facebook streaming will end, and we will start again at 5 minutes to 3. No. Yes, that's right. We start 5 minutes to 3, 14:55. So see you back shortly.